Welcome to Getting to Zero Interview Analysis. This is a behind-the-scenes look at the interviews that we're running for the Getting to Zero podcast as part of Zero Blockers. What we're doing in the podcast is interviewing people like we would in a continuous discovery interview session. So this podcast, we break down why we're asking the questions we are, how we're thinking as they're responding, and then how we're progressing and moving the interview in the way that we want to get the insights that we want. So if you're starting on your journey in continuous interviewing, then hopefully this interview series will give you insights into the types of questions to ask, the types of things to avoid, and then how you can get the most insights possible from your interviews. In this episode today, we're interviewing Rodger, who's the CEO of Voxgig, and previously he's been co-founder of Nearform, one of the world's largest Node.js consultancies. And what we're asking is the same thing we always ask: what's the biggest problem in software development? So let's jump right in. I'm going to jump right in with the hairy question that we always ask. What is your number one problem in your software development process? And that means end to end, from coming up with the idea until you've got satisfied customers. So that's a very generic question. And because of that, we're going to get a very generic answer. And generic answers aren't very useful for us, but we need to start somewhere. So it's okay to start with a generic question as long as you realize that you're going to have to dive deeper based on the responses that they give.
In our world, developer relations, problem, which might sound a bit odd, is getting buy-in from executive leadership in the value of what we do and the value of what our clients do. So we're helping developer relations teams build better APIs, better portals, better documentation, better communities. And if you've worked in developer relations, or if you are a developer, you know how important that is. But the challenge for a lot of our clients, and it becomes our challenge then, is how do you get leadership to understand the value of the developer communities that have built up around their products? It's a little bit more of a people problem, perhaps, than classic software development.
So a very generic answer, but he's given us something that we can tie into stakeholder buy-in. Yeah, if I can summarize, and you correct me if I'm wrong, the challenge is really around the buy-in and stakeholder engagement of what you want to build, which I think is a classic problem, that people have an idea of this would be fantastic for our customers, but you just don't have that business buy-in. So it's always great to summarize, because that's when you can play back to the person what you understand from what they're saying. And sometimes you're correct and sometimes you're incorrect, and they will tell you where you're getting some misconceptions. Now, what I did there as well was I tried to make it a bit more generic, because I'm also conscious this is for a podcast. So I don't want to lose people thinking this is purely developer relations related. This is a broader problem of stakeholder buy-in.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, right? I was in
This is perfect. We're looking for examples. So it's great. I didn't actually prompt him and he jumped into it, because that was going to be my next step of asking for very specific examples.
Sales pitch the other day. I was at quite a large company in specific vertical, and most of their business is actually executed via an API. So I said to one of the senior people on the call, "You're an API company." And there was a 5-minute pause, and he was there. God damn it, you're right. That's actually what we are. It's a little bit more subtle than that, though, because you can actually categorize it into two different types of businesses that we work with. One is developer first, which means that the developer starts using the product. The developer starts using the API. And I categorize, a company that lets you send email, for example, something like that, transactional email, whereas the developer that first tries out the SDK, that type of stuff, and then ultimately recommends it, versus the much larger percentage of companies out there that are developer enabled, which means that there's still a classic business sales process that might be B2B or might happen in person-to-person meetings, that type of stuff. But then the actual execution and delivery of the service still involves developers on both sides building stuff.
This is great. So he's given us words and terminology that he uses. So developer first and developer enable. And that's great because we can validate then, is that a common thing across the industry? And if so, we should start using those terms when we're marketing and communicating our product.
And those companies, there tend to be challenges because once the sales people have done the deal, for all developers suddenly have to use APIs where the documentation might be a little wanting.
It's that kind of developer-enabled business where you're seeing that buy-in because the business think that they're in a different business, kind of the customer versus the user.
If you're in the software...
So that was me just trying to validate that the problem is actually with developer-enabled. So he gave us two different classifications, but from what I understood so far, the first one, developer first, aren't a problem. It's the developer-enabled. So I wanted to validate that that is the case.
For industry, there's a lot of software companies that do this right. You might not appreciate the difficulty that exists when you're trying to integrate with vertical companies that need an API for various reasons. There's 200 million APIs as of 2024. All sorts of companies have APIs now because you need that to integrate with all sorts of different things. But if the company offering the API is not a software first company, all sorts of fun and games ensue.
So this is actually great. He's actually given us a quantification as well. So we're now narrowing down on where our problem space is. It's not developer first, it's developer enabled, which he's quantified as being the majority. We could dig deeper into that to see if he has any numbers, but he's told us that there's 200 million APIs out there. So that is fantastic kind of insight into how big this market is and how big this problem is.
You're right, there's an open banking regulation in Europe now, so banks have to provide APIs. That's super fun, right? So we have aggregators that aggregate all of these banking APIs and deal with all the variability, shall we say, in how they operate. But you can imagine that banks are not, they write a lot of software, but their leadership is not thinking about software. They have their cornflakes in the morning or caviar time for breakfast. So the challenge...
So now he's given us an even more specific open banking regulation. This is perfect. We could dig into this and ask, okay, what was your last experience with open banking? I didn't go in that direction in this interview because, again, it is for a slightly different audience. This is for a podcast. So if I were trying to understand really deeply the experience problems he was having, I would have dug deeper into that open banking and seen if he had very specific examples. Because remember, it's the examples that tell you how people really behave and not how they perceive they behave or how they would like to behave. So it's always best to try to get very specific examples.
It's an interesting one. We've taken a big chunk out of the world, 200 million APIs. But the digestion process has only begun and it's pretty painful. And I'm not going to take that metaphor any further, although it's quite apt given what comes out.
It's always great if you can get your interviewee at ease, because the questions that you're asking, you're trying to find their problems and their pain points. So this can be a little bit difficult for people because they like to say that, no, I'm a professional, I'm fantastic, I can look after all these aspects of my job. But you're looking for them to admit areas where there's problems. So it's always best to try get a rapport going on. If people are laughing, that's great because then they might share a little bit more than they would if they were feeling a bit tense and nervous.
That's a brilliant example, and I think that's a common one that people would have. It's very specific to your use case of APIs, but the concept of getting that buy-in to be able to focus on the technology when the technology to a lot of the business is secondary, or they perceive it as secondary.
So again, I'm summarizing and I'm trying to take it away from the generic, from the specific of APIs to being more generic for the podcast audience. That's actually a bad practice to do in a regular interview because you want to get into the specifics. You can do that kind of translation to make it more generic outside of the interview, after the interview. So it is a bad practice to do that in the interview, but I'm doing it more from a thinking about the general audience of the podcast. So again, don't try to bring everything back to generic, make it specific, dive deeper into the open banking solution.
Can you give me an example of the last time this happened, but talk about the impact? How did this make your work harder? And what was the impact of not getting that buy-in?
So what I'm trying to do here is often people will say, this is a huge problem. And then when you ask them, well, what's the result of that? They might say, well, it's not that much. Like we work around it, it takes a day and we solve it. And that's a problem because then if you built a big solution around this problem, nobody's going to pay for it because the impact isn't severe enough. So you want to find something that's really painful. As they say, it's always better to sell a painkiller than it is a villain.
It increases costs on both sides, on the provider of the API and the consumer. I can think of a particular project.
Cost is great. So he's now confirmed that there's a cost side here, which is brilliant because then you can hopefully come up with a product or solution that will reduce that cost.
Where delivery time was probably doubled. A couple of months were easily added to the project overall until there were no more bug reports, no more issues to resolve, just because the importance of having a smooth integration wasn't really taken seriously, I would say, by either part, right? It was just assumed that the developers will just work weekends and make it. If there'd been more buy-in around documentation or generating examples, even maybe a webinar or two, things might have gone a bit more smooth.
So now this will happen a lot. The person you're interviewing is suggesting solutions to the problem. And it's so tempting to just jump on those solutions and go, these are the solutions to the problem. Let's build that. We've validated it with customers. They've told us they need this. But it's unfortunately not always the best solution. They're presenting solutions that they can think of, but it's your job to understand the problem space that they're facing and then find the best solutions for it. So I'm going to dig deeper into this point because I want to understand whether these are the best solutions to this.
Just because you don't have a big open source community doesn't mean your API doesn't have a community. I know it's more interesting to focus on the challenging side of things, but I can name names for people that have done it really well. I've worked at an Irish company called Evervault. They provide encryption as a service. And what they do that's absolutely fantastic is they have a Slack channel per engagement. A lot of companies have a shared Slack channel, but of course, it's very hard to discuss confidential information in a shared forum. But Evervault have gone to the bother building their own Slack bot infrastructure internally so that they're actually pretty responsive.
You're not talking about building out your internal API. You're talking about doing an implementation of integrating with each individual client.
So here I was trying to understand. So he's giving me an example, which is amazing. He's always looking for very specific examples of how this problem was solved. I was a little bit confused at this point because he was talking initially about the company and the company creating the API. But this example seems to be more about the customers implementing the API and integrating with the API. So my question here was just trying to validate, where is he talking about solving this problem? And because it seems like it's more the implementation than the creation side.
Each individual client gets a private Slack channel from Evervault.
Coming back to your problem, you said was...
Yeah, I'm coming back because I was thinking, he told me when he came up with the suggestions, better documentation, implementation guides, some like working software, and maybe a webinar or two. And then his specific example of how it's best being solved was direct access to developers via Slack channel. So it seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between the idealized standard and how people have done it in practice. So that's an area that we should dig into more.
The increased cost and time doubled. I guess I'm trying to figure out the source. Is it you've designed a poor API that means that you're putting the pain on the integration?
That's a really good question. So Rory...
So again, he's said, and it was great, cost. So that's something that we can target as a product. We can say, okay, we can reduce cost. But I'm trying to dig deeper into understanding where is that cost, because that cost could be in multiple places. And until we pinpoint the exact area, we'll struggle to find, or we might inadvertently build a product that's solving in the wrong area. So I'm really trying to figure out what's adding to that cost.
The problem is fundamental. It's structural. Okay. I can go to ChatGPT or Stack Overflow and ask a question about the React API any day of the week, and I'll get an answer. But if I built a proprietary API that maybe only has 50 or 100 client companies using it, the community just isn't big enough. There just isn't enough material out there. So developers' usual sources of information, like Stack Overflow or even ChatGPT or Google, they're not particularly useful. So there's a huge amount of friction in just knowing how to integrate, what code to write, what examples do I get. I think the particular innovation that Everwald came up with, and you're asking about what are the challenges, that specific challenge is the implementing developers just don't know where to turn. And then they're dependent upon traditional support vendor. But how do you get that support, right? Is it just documentation? But out-of-date documentation, right? Maybe if you're lucky, a sample averaging. What we've seen that's most effective is when there's some sort of interactive support.
Okay, so now with getting more into the detail, the documentation, there's concerns now. Maybe it's out-of-date documentation, so maybe that's not the best solution. The working app or two, it's the interactive support. Okay, so now we're honing in on where is possibly going to be the best way of solving this.
Now, Everwald's with their Slack bots, you're acknowledged the second you put in a message, and then they have some sort of cool rota system where developers, as part of their day job, are assigned it. And so you're actually getting access to their senior developers, pretty much.
I'm going to jump in because I'm going to be the cold-hearted business person who says we're not a technology company. And what it sounds like is we've made the sale. That's just an implementation problem. So how is this impacting? If I am that product-enabled person, how is this making my business worse? Yes, we've passed the problem on to our customers and it is a problem there, but we've already got their money.
So again, I'm trying to understand, do we have a product or a problem to solve here? Because if the company who's making the sale, this product-enabled company, don't see a problem at all, then it's going to be very hard for us to make a sale or explain how our product helps their problems because they don't see a problem at all. And maybe, yes, it's a bit of pain for customers. That's just part of doing business. So what I'm trying to get at here is who is feeling this pain? Who understands that this is a problem?
Have you, right? A lot of deals involve usage-based pricing. So until the usage ramps up, you ain't billing, right? And the blocker there is how quickly can the developers write the code to start using what?
So that's a brilliant example. So now we can narrow in on companies who have usage-based pricing, because that's one where we can sell it to them as a direct benefit
to your offer. But even if it isn't usage-based billing, if your own support teams or internal developers keep getting dragged into conference calls to show people how to write code, that's just friction. So the per deal friction is high. The unit cost per deal is high. And that's economics 101. But if you ignore the...
Now this, I probably could have, if I was really trying to solve a problem in this space, I would dig a bit deeper here, because the challenge, the second one, the per usage billing, brilliant, but the friction and the cost, because the idealized solution is that they have more access to our developers, not less. So we would need to dig in deeper here to see whether this is actually a problem that we're solving.
The developer paying, your unit economics kind of suck, right? There is sort of hard proof that this really matters. Stripe is the hard proof. If anyone integrated with payment APIs prior to Stripe, horrible, right? Weeks and weeks of messing around and trying to get stuff to work versus Stripe where it works straight away. And guess what? They turned out to be a unicorn. I think there's hard proof that if you reduce developer friction, and if you put effort into it, invest in it, pays literal real dividends.
So this is now a different example. And Stripe is a brilliant example because they're renowned for how good their documentation is and how good their code examples are. So this actually does back up the original invest in documentation, invest in your working examples, invest in your webinars. But also Slack does give quite good access and good support if you do have a problem. So it's kind of actually both. And I think from Stripe's, my understanding from Stripe, and this is something that you would have to dig deeper into, is that because they're investing so much in their documentation and improving it, that their amount of support is manageable because people are able to self-support a lot of the time.
Who is the person who feels this the most in the company? Because your salespeople are probably happy they've got the deal. And then is it up to your development team? Is it your support team? Or in Evervolt's case, the same team because your developers are the support?
So what I'm trying to do here is really zone in on who is feeling the pain. Because if we're trying to pitch a product and a solution here, we need to know our buyer persona. We need to know who is the one who is going to sign our checks to solve this problem. Because if we try pitch it to the wrong person, they might say, oh yeah, it's a problem, but they're never going to be the ones who are going to buy our product. So I'm really trying to figure out who has the most pain and the most desire to solve this.
Who feels the most pain?
This is a challenge, right? Because there's a bit of a disconnect here. Ultimately, of course, it's the CEO because his or her.
We don't want the CEO. Some products, yes, you have to go to the CEO. But you don't want every product to have to go to the CEO because that's a much more expensive person to get in front of. Deals take longer. It's a harder deal to do. So if we can, and what I tried to do is I tried to push and see maybe who's the champion, who's trying to influence the CEO, who's the person who's going to really engage with me first and then push it. Maybe it does have to go to the CEO, but it's always best to try and find somebody lower in the chain.
Their numbers suck. They don't achieve the growth that they were trying to achieve. But responsibility for this issue is highly fragmented because, yes, the salespeople, job done, right? Now, they might be a bit annoyed because their commissions are a bit late coming in. It's not the end of the world. And then you have customer success. It depends what metrics you have in place. If you're just seeing developers as a cost center, you're seeing customer success as a cost center as well. A lot of companies don't have joined up thinking on this. They're just saying, oh, well, we have to have customer.
Who's leading the charge then to fix this?
So what I was doing there is I'm trying to figure out who is the person feeling the most pain. The first question, I got a very generic answer and I got, oh, it's everybody, it's all over the place. So I'm trying a second time to see if I can get a bit more specific on who's the person who's taking ownership of solving this problem.
Comes back to a truism in developer relations that we found in just observing the market and clients that we've. Unless there is high level buy-in, and at the highest levels, literally the founder, CEO of the company, that this stuff is important, it ends up being a drag on the company that isn't organizationally understood. Not to disparage other disciplines and people who work in other areas of the business, right? But if you work in sales, you can increase your results just by adding extra hours. It's not a particularly good approach. And, of course you should be using better sales processes, et cetera, but there is a relatively direct correlation. As you know, in software, if you increase the hours, you're ultimately stacking up technical debt and it ends up creating huge amounts of costs down the line. If you have bad documentation, every rollout takes a month extra, right? But it's not very visible. And that month extra can be reduced to only 2 weeks extra if you crack the whip hard enough and get people to work weekends. It's just not sustainable. It's a classic business problem, right? You have optimization at the edges rather than solving the fundamental.
So this is a challenging problem to solve because if there isn't somebody who's really feeling the pain of this, then it's not something that anybody is really looking for. And the example you said, you're solving problems at the edges, but you're not solving the fundamental problem. Or another way of putting it, you're tackling the symptoms, the problem, but you're not tackling the cause. So this is a difficult problem to try sell a solution.
A joined up system thinking of where the problem is. And in the companies that you've been working with, who is leading the charge on solving this? Because you're obviously going in there advocating for this systems approach to solving it. Who's signing your checks?
I've gone very blunt. I've gotten two very generic answers. He's pointed again both times to the CEO. Now, I'm trying to figure out, is that the person who's really engaging with this problem? I've gone possibly too blunt by saying who's signing your checks, but what I'm trying to figure out is who is the person who's recognized this as a problem and is putting money behind solving.
I won't mention our clients because I can't, but I will mention a really good example from a very good friend of mine. So there's a cloud hosting company called Platformatic, developer.com, set up by a very good friend of mine, Matteo Kalina. If you look at how they engage with developers, Mateo's one of the founders, he's a CTO, he live codes on Twitch once a week. The thing is, from a developer perspective, you can see that that's a founding team that actually cares about developers. And if you go and use their stuff and use their APIs, it's all very slick and it all fits together really well. And there's lots of example code. And there's a community that's being nurtured. So you're not just dependent on one company. And it's layered on top of an open source community. So it's just hitting all those developer love points that you want to hit. And why are they doing well? What's the secret? I think somebody at the C level has to have been a coder and has to have some sort of clout, right?
I guess more so in these kind of API-centric, developer first versus developer enabled.
So the example that I got there was a developer first example. And he's already said at the start, that's not a problem because everybody already has the buy-in. So the challenge was I went a bit too blunt about asking who's paying for it, and he didn't want to answer that question. So he's diverted and kind of pointed it elsewhere. I've asked 3 times about who is signing the checks, and you have to realize at some point that you should back away. So he diverted it there to a developer first example, which isn't the problem space. So now we need to move on from that and start looking at something else. I think we've taken this quite far.
But do you feel developer enabled, it's as important?
Yeah, and ironically, I think the person who should be paying the most attention there is the CFO, because isn't it their job to pay attention to unit economics and fixed cost bases and stuff like that? And in a lot of these companies, the CFO anyway sort of ends up with responsibility for IT. IT director or whatever usually ends up reporting to them. So I'd say on a pure financial basis, there is a significant amount of cost optimization.
So jumping into what do we do about it?
So now that I've kind of pushed as much on the problem and the impact and who's feeling the pain, I want to see what are the solutions, because what are people trying today? What are they looking at? How are they trying to solve it? Because again, even if it's a big problem, nobody's putting in the effort to see are there solutions or what's out there, then it's going to be hard for us to sell a product, because if nobody's looking for it, then it's hard to sell it.
There are these problems, and I think this is a common problem. How you've described it is very specific to APIs and developer first products, but I think you could generalize this to being any upfront design work.
Yeah, this is an aspect of software development, but this specifically is a fundamental issue, and it applies to all software projects in non-software companies.
Now, you don't need to name names, but if you can give an idea of how do you tackle this problem, because this is a fundamental problem, and unless you do it, as you say, things take double the amount of time, cost twice as much. So how do you fix it?
There are no silver bullets here. We in the software development space have to chip away at from both ends. It's an education problem. It's a professionalism problem for us. It's an economic problem. There isn't an easy answer. The problem, unfortunately,
this is actually surprisingly a positive answer, because if everything was easy and it was solved problem, then you're going to find difficulty getting in your product. So you are looking for those ones where people are saying, oh, this is hard, this is difficult. But you do need to kind of dig in, as we have, trying to figure out who's feeling the pain, who's the one who's willing to invest in.
See a lot of solutions to problems in software development that ultimately come down to, oh, well, you're not doing it right. That's why it failed. But at the end of the day, humans are extremely fallible. So the process has to work despite the humans. But we do have good examples. Airline safety is my go-to example for practices that we should bring into mainstream software development. Zero blame culture. Retrospectives that actually matter, that actually have an impact. So this is the lesson that we actually learned. Now let's roll it out.
How did they solve because they would have equally had this divisional mindset of, if this is my area, this is my area, this is my area. But of course, the problems are across boundary.
And so he's given an example that he likes. I wanted to figure out how they solved it. Is that something generic we could incorporate into our product?
Airplanes used to crash a lot more. I think, unfortunately, a somewhat useful forcing function, which is people dying, tends to focus the mind. But you know what? Improving the bottom line, improving profitability is also highly motivational. I think the problem there is that the forcing function isn't strong enough. A lot of companies that we work with are almost doing developer relations as a luxury. They're extremely profitable.
Luxury, when they're talking about your product, isn't ideal. Yes, luxury products make a lot of money, but you want to be selling that painkiller. You don't want to be selling the vitamin. So if people only see your problem space as a luxury, it means that they're potentially not willing to invest as much as you would need in order to sell your product.
Doing it badly doesn't hurt. And then you have startups where you either have to do it well or you die, right? But how do you change the large number of companies and verticals that are not software, that don't have, like fintech companies have loads more, most. So in a way, they can tolerate bad software development practices.
But they're losing market share dramatically, traditional banks to the new banks.
So this is me trying to qualify what he's saying. So he's saying that because companies are making so much money, they can tolerate bad practices. Is that true? So I'm just kind of trying to see whether there is a difference here.
As I'm sure any bank manager will tell you, you can't live on the never ever. Technical debt eventually has to be paid. But that's a long process because you have some very deep numbers. But I don't know, where's the forcing function for vertical companies that are making money, but not serious money, and that don't have leadership that really understands this issue, and yet they find themselves with large software development teams and APIs to manage.
So it's brilliant. So he doesn't have the direct answer himself. You're not expecting the person you're interviewing to give you the answers to it. You're expecting them to tell you the problems, and it's up to you as the team to figure out, using what technology is just recently available, what insights you have from the industry, what insights you have from other interviews, to figure out what solutions could potentially work. Then you have to recognize that those solutions are all assumptions, and validate all of those assumptions before you invest too much in building a giant product.
So you need a crisis to change, and if you don't have a crisis, make one.
There was a crisis that I knew about. I don't know what's happened, but presumably it has been fixed in some way. In a previous life, one of the customers that we had was running.
So again, brilliant. He's going into an example. I didn't force it with my comments more than a question, but it's great that he's going into an example. So hopefully this now will show us more insights into how people are solving this problem and how we can kind of potentially build our product around it.
Their entire system of a legacy machine. And they had built a really cool API on top of it, but the fundamental process was still running on one big server. And every year or two, they would just buy bigger hardware. But as you know, Moore's Law kind of stopped a few years ago, so I really don't know. The problem was when we were interfacing with that company, the issue was very clear. The refactoring work was very clear. The fact that it had to be moved from a monolith to some sort of distributed, scalable microservice architecture was all very, very clear. And yet, in a 3 to 4 year engagement with that client where we built lots of software for them, that step was never taken.
Yeah. It's not the burning fire.
Not yet. Not this year.
Okay, so
that example wasn't great because it ended up being people didn't work because the workarounds that they had were sufficient. And if you keep encountering that people have workarounds for your big problem and they're sufficient, then maybe you need to shift the problem space you're looking at.
Actually, just jump. Let's go back in time. You have two vastly different past lives, I would say. Nearform, which is a consultancy, and then Feed Henry, which is a product company. We've talked now about the challenge of not investing enough or not having the buy-in to make sure that the user experience of your product is high quality enough, which is going to improve a lot of things, save you time and money. Is there anything else that jumps out to you from your other experience that would be classified as you had to solve?
So I had two options here. I could have kept going down the route of asking another, like, what's the second biggest problem that you're facing, and then trying to dig into that. Because I think I've exhausted this problem space of the stakeholder buy-in. I decided to go and ask about other experience. It's either option is working, although it is preferable to ask about more recent experience for a reason we'll see shortly.
Feed Henry was successful. And in a way, that's because senior management did have buy-in the user experience. What's ironic about Feed Henry is that a lot of the challenges we faced then, so this is going back 10, 15 years, the march of time and progress in software development.
So 10, 15 years, that's a long time. So maybe I'm starting to think at this point when he's answering, I'm thinking, okay, maybe this mightn't be so relevant, but let's follow out the line of thinking and just see whether there's anything generic here.
Has actually removed a lot of those challenges. We bought our own servers. We ran 20 physical servers. We were using Subversion for version control. We were on a 2-week agile cycle. The first Monday of every 2 weeks was lost. So we used to call it Merge Mondays. It's important just to pause for a minute and actually, if you look back, things have got better. You don't notice it year in, year out, but we've got rid of a lot of really horrible problems.
And was that your biggest challenge? Was it the technical part of the product development?
So I wanted to move away from these technical problems because they've been solved. So that's not of any use to us anymore. So I was trying to see whether there was anything else along in this example, but the 10 to 15 years, I'm thinking, let's move off quickly from this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the Feed Henry was a 30-person startup, almost from the word go, a 30 technical person startup. It was straight into large-scale software development in a way that you just wouldn't have to these days. You wouldn't need a team to run your servers. I would say in some ways the things that we fret about and worry about come back in 10 years and they might be gone, right? I know that's not particularly helpful.
I think you're...
So, yeah, I didn't get anything out of that line of questioning, so I'm going to move on.
Very accurate on the technical challenges that we're facing. I don't think the people challenges and the communication challenges are going away.
So maybe Nearform is more interesting there, like, because one of the...
So there was a bit of a short edit there, but we've moved on now to different experience because I wanted to move away from that really long ago experience to see if there's anything more recent.
Skills we developed was we were building software a lot of the time for non-technical companies, not software. Clearly, right? We're a software consultancy, so people know us to build their software. And there's always a gap between what people want. So you might think, oh, total transparency is really, really good. We'll get the client onto all of the stand-ups and that type of stuff. But the problem with engineering is you have to discuss failure modes, you have to discuss risks, this type of thing. So if you have total transparency and you bring on somebody who's not technical, they don't sleep very well after a couple of weeks because the developers are always discussing disaster scenarios, right? There's always this challenge around how do you provide information in a way that's useful to people who don't understand the technical details.
So great. We've got another example here of communication between kind of development and stakeholders. So this is a second area that we can start to dig in to see if this is a problem.
I mean, we as lay people have the same problem when it comes to medicine, right? Our doctors have to do the same thing with us. And if you take that inside an organization, how does a software development team inside an organization present their activities usefully to senior management so they can make useful decisions without scaring the bejesus out of them or acting like everything is fine and don't, ignore the man behind the curtain. And it seems to be a very soft skill that you can only pick up.
Is that really that big of a problem, though? What impacts does it cause if we just have a little bit of insular communication and we don't really
do the transparency? So I'm trying to qualify this problem in the exact same way I did with the last one. What are the impacts? Because yes, this could be a really annoying problem, but it doesn't cause that much of an impact. And if that's the case, then it's not a problem that people are thinking about solving.
The biggest one is the classic issue of software projects are going great, everything's on time until the last week, and suddenly it all falls apart. And for some reason, it was due to be delivered next week, and it only appears 2 months later. That's because there was no safe way to communicate a realistic perspective on where the project was. There's no silver bullets, right? Just one of the tactics that we used to use was putting a lot of effort into steering clients away from hard schedules and instead offering a lot of flexibility by saying that we would collaborate on the features.
So we're moving into a solution here of, instead of trying to communicate progress, it's shifting to a more collaborative way of working so that you're working together. So this is interesting, and it's giving us something, and particularly it's almost an example, but it's not quite. So I'm going to have to dig in.
So we give the client the ability to change their minds every week and try to share the problem space. You have to build a lot of trust.
That's fantastic. How do you build that trust though? Because the saying, like, if I'm with clients and I'm hearing from my consultancy, oh, let's not do hard dates, I'm hearing, I don't want to be held accountable.
Oh yeah, billable hours.
Yeah. So I'm just trying to play devil's advocate. I find playing devil's advocate quite good because it makes people validate and kind of back up some of the things they're saying. Because I'm always trying to say, well, is it an impact? Particularly when people say it's the biggest impact and everybody's screaming for it and everybody wants it. And then it's always good to qualify those statements because maybe it's not the case. So I'm qualifying whether this solution is feasible, because building trust with people that you've never met before, particularly in a consultancy environment, that's very difficult to do. So particularly when you're saying, and I fully back up what Richard is saying here, of it's a better way of working because you can be more collaborative and figure out the problem and then the solution versus just building something with so many assumptions built in. I want to see how he's solving this problem.
Absolutely.
Do you have any examples where you did that really successfully, and how did you do it?
So again, always bring it from, everything so far has been very generic, and I wanted to get into more specifics.
Yeah, one part of it is how you interface with the external world. So Nearform was really, really good at putting our money where our mouth was in terms of supporting developers and open source communities and running events where we would get people to talk about real world challenges. It's not like the company was just a front for a lot of low-cost developers somewhere. A lot of people in the company were people that you could validate that they were actually experts. That meant that the cost base was higher. You had to pay more to get high-caliber people like that. And the other one was about, I guess, the intentionality of building trust. We had this concept of something called a trust battery. And when you started engaging with a client, the job was to charge it up as quickly as possible.
That's great. We've got a brand, build out your brand, and that's a very long-term play. That's a very strategic thing to do. But now we're getting into a bit more specific on each instance. There's a trust battery. So that's something we could look up. Do other people use this term? Is this a common thing to talk about trust batteries? Because again, we can then use that in our communication. We'll help you supercharge your trust battery or something like that. So let's see where the example goes. But this is promising because now he's giving us very specific details.
And that meant not overcommitting on any early stuff and being very careful about what you promised in the first couple of weeks and first couple of months. So if you said, no, we can't do X because this part will take longer, but we'll do everything else and it will be delivered on time, making sure that that was a priority.
And how effective was that?
So what I'm trying to validate here is, because people will give you their solution, say, oh, this is amazing. And then you hear the next thing, oh, well, it didn't work. So this is kind of just trying to validate, are the ideas that we're coming up with really the most effective ones? Because again, we don't have to follow the solutions that people are giving us, but it is interesting to hear how people are solving it and whether that's working.
For the most part, it worked really, really well. Because at the end of the day, you've got to remember the dynamics of a consulting project are that the project managers and the project owners, whether they be middle managers or VPs or directors or whatever, on the client side, putting their ass on the line. Because they've probably chosen you as the consultant. And they're probably internally responsible for the success of the project. So it may feel like they have lots of power by dictating whatever features they want, timelines or whatever. But actually, they're basically powerless. And you as the consultant have all of the power. And you could run rings around them if you want. And a lot of consultants do. They go for short-term gains. So another way that you build trust is by really making sure that you're...
That example there was brilliant because it's always great to empathize with your customers and really understand. And I wouldn't have thought of that previously. I wouldn't have thought, oh, the person hiring the consultants is the one at most risk. But it's a great point because they've put their neck on the line to hire in this consultant. So now the consultant has the power in the relationship. So it is, in the short term at least. So that's an interesting way of really getting insights into your market, and that can help influence how you position your product.
Empathizing with the client project owners. You're understanding the context in which they're operating. The way the software projects fail, if they end in feature fights. I don't know where I came across that term, but anyway, a feature fight is when there's a big spreadsheet and there's supposed to be a load of tick marks against the features and everybody's arguing about, is it done, is it not done? Client won't sign off until everything's ticked. Then the client starts expending tons of resources, demanding features that they don't really need. The developers start cutting loads of corners, just get them over the line. Project ends up like a silly mess, like that post office software in UK. Right. I bet you that ended in a feature fight. And it was just get it over the line, don't care. But if you understand the dynamics of your...
So feature fight is something, again, like trust battery. Is that something that's used a lot in the industry? These kind of terms that come up a lot are things that we really should investigate and understand and see if this is the terminology that we should be using
for client project owners and the pressures they are under, whether they're trying to get a promotion or if there's a specific initiative that is extremely important for the business, or whether it's just about winding down an old cost center. You've got to understand that context. And then if you align with that, you can offer technical advice on what the best things to do are. It's learning by doing knowledge, right? It's tacit knowledge. A lot of the people that founded Nearform had come from a whole bunch of startups and consultancies and all that sort of stuff, right? It wasn't the first rodeo.
I love problems that are learning by doing, or you just need experience, you just need to know, because they always seem like they're the impossible problems to solve. But we have so many examples of where people have been able to build a product that previously it was, well, only the experts can do this, only the people with years of experience. So if you can figure out a way to solve something like that, that is actually a big win for people, because then they can solve and deliver products and deliver the same quality, but with more junior people. You don't need those seniors to solve it. So I love those kind of problems. And when I hear it, I think, yes, this is something that I want to dig in and figure it out.
And do you look for anything that would help you, or did you try to figure out how do other people do this?
So what I was asking there is, if this is such a big problem, did you even take the effort of going on Google to try see, is there a solution out there? Is there a product? Is there a way of doing this? Or did you just battle on? Because if people aren't taking that initial step to search, then they're never going to find your product.
No, we were definitely making it up as we went along. But it was from shared pain. There was a lot of alignment around how to engage with clients, and a lot of alignment around, we're not just going to dump a load of software on you, but we're really going to try to understand, what are you actually trying to do here at a more fundamental level?
Your two examples, I think, are the same example, because what you've described is, and let me summarize, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but whether you're building an API, you need to think of the end customer, what they really need. Or whether you're in a consultancy, what do the users need? Not what features you're asking for, but what do the users actually need? And then your secondary thing is to convince whoever's kind of paying the bills or whoever's deciding to trust you that you are doing right by the end users and are going to build the right thing.
Exactly. There's no quick fix for doing that, right?
So I was just trying to summarize there, and I was joining up two solutions in my mind that were the same thing. Again, I wouldn't advocate for this in every interview, because I'm moving away. I've just taken it from when we were talking in specifics. I've just brought it back to generic. So this is a bad practice to do in a standard interview. What I'm trying to do is bring this back for the audience of the podcast. So I have a slightly different audience in mind. But in general, you shouldn't generalize. You should keep it in the specifics, because that's where you're going to get the...
But you've got to earn it. It takes time. Does it just come back to the intent to do that? Or having a shared value system that's the approach you're going to take? It's very hard to write down a set of rules, right? Because you can't even say, be honest, because pure honesty causes freakouts for a client. ends up being completely stressed out.
I'm sure there's a fantastic story of a stressed out client, but I didn't dig into it.
Do you have a look at anything along the lines of shared accountability, of trying to make people understand, instead of you being the conduit of trying to convey the problems, of trying to build their listening?
So I have an issue with the.
So what I've tried to do here is I'm trying to figure out if he tried to solve it in a different way other than being the man in the middle. Because the two examples were that he would go in, he would recognize this problem, and then he would work as building his trust battery and getting the buy-in of the different people. But what I was looking for is there another option that he looked at? Because again, back to that Google approach, has he Googled for a solution? Because if he hasn't, then it's going to be difficult if nobody is searching for the solutions to this. So I'm just trying to see if he tried anything else so that I can see other alternatives for solving this problem.
For accountability when it comes to business professionalism. It's not that it's a bad idea, right? And it's not that it's not necessary in many projects, but accountability is an extrinsic force on people. They're performing because they're scared or they're looking for a reward. But what you really want is intrinsic motivation.
So what I asked was, have you tried to build collaboration between kind of the developers, the stakeholders, be the man in the middle? But because I used the word accountability in the question, answer has gone off on a complete tangent. So my job, and this will happen quite a bit in interviews, and you need to be aware of it because you can lose a lot of time on these tangents. Sometimes they might be interesting, but in this case, I think I've accidentally brought it in the wrong direction. So I'm thinking, how can I bring this back?
Satisfaction of being a professional and delivering something professional. A lot of people really like that, right? It's very satisfying. It's self-fulfillment.
Other than accountability, then, in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, the book, he took the manager from each area and swapped them and just said, figure it out.
So I tried to back away from accountability, and I gave an example of how somebody else has tried to solve this conflict between two different areas. And so I'm hoping that will bring it back on track.
That's kind of a fun experiment. I'd forgotten he did that, yeah. It's very hard to create a culture like that when you have things like stack ranking. In a way, that's trying to formalize almost measuring for intrinsic motivation, but all it does is optimize for defensive, physical behavior, right? So
stack ranking is actually quite interesting because if we're trying to encourage a solution, and our product could be solving this in any way, but it's something to look out for because something like stack ranking, as Richard explains, it creates a political culture where it is each person for themselves. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Maybe we should be kind of figuring it out. That could be one of our early questions when we're trying to qualify whether our leads are useful, is how do you do kind of promotions or how do you understand performance management? Because stack ranking might conflict with our potential solution.
Problem with intrinsic motivation is it's something that you have to let emerge. So you've got to let people mess up. You've got to allow people to reach that point. But what happens is once you have a critical mass of people who are working to build really good stuff for its own sake, everybody else tends to get really excited by the fact that the lack of cynicism in an environment like that, which is incredibly.
Yeah, so it's back to that trust, intrinsic motivation, engaging with people.
So yeah, it kind of veered off again back into the accountability, intrinsic motivation. So I'm just recapping here, and I think I'm going to close it out because we ran out of time. And it is always good to be respectful of people's time, even though I could have kept going here. I could have asked another half hour's worth of questions easily, but I needed to be conscious of Richard's time and be respectful.
I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you for sharing your background and history and stories. I hope it was insightful for you as well as for everybody. Your background speaks for itself. 3 successful companies, so you can't be doing something.
Well, 2.5. We're still working on number 3. Come back in a little while. Rory, thank you so much. Marvelous. Take care. Bye-bye.
So I hope that was insightful and interesting to hear how we broke up and what I was thinking of as I was asking those questions and how I broke up and designed and tried to encourage a flow through the questions that we were asking in the interview. If you did enjoy it, all I ask is that you like and subscribe. We'll be releasing these videos after every podcast that we release to try help you understand how interviews can go right, but also how they can go wrong. And even the mistakes I'm making, I'll happily point those out in the interview analysis as well. Thank you for joining, and see you in the next one.
If you'd like to know more about the ways you can remove the blocking dependencies from your processes, check out zeroblockers.com or follow us on your favorite social platforms.